Hello everybody, this is Nick, and welcome again to Nick Eats Food. It's getting hotter in here. That's not just because we're getting closer to summer and there's still snow on the ground. I'm eating more peppers, and I've eaten jalapeno, I've eaten a serrano pepper, and here we have a habanero. Now I'm getting nervous. I've acted a little bit in the previous ones, and I've looked up Scoville units for peppers. So the serrano pepper is 8,000 to 22,000 on the Scoville unit scale. I had this one is 150 to 325,000 on the Scoville unit. So it's like 10 times hotter. I have milk at the ready. Don't have tissues. Look, tissues. I love my life. I'm a little shaky, honestly. It's still crunchy. There is a sweetness. That's kind of nice. A little hot. Okay. The sweetness is helpful. Oh, my tongue's on fire. This is way worse. I'm not gonna drink milk. It's so much hotter. It's not even close. I can't stop moving. I just gotta keep... Guys, that's so bad. Don't do that. I'm sweating. My tongue's on fire. My whole mouth is just... Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna go to the hospital. Oh, that's immediate. More. This has been Nick Kills Himself. No, I shouldn't say that. This has been Nick Eats Food. If someone buys me a cake, I will eat it in front of him, I promise. It burns. It's better when the milk is in there and then immediately just heat is back. This has been Nick Eats Food. Back to you, Michael.
Hey friends, well, last Sunday we had our workshop on racial reconciliation, and it was a great event, and we had a lot of really good discussion, so much so that we went a little long, and I never got the opportunity to dive into this section of teaching. And so I wanted to record a short video that just goes through what I think is a really important topic for us in discussing our current racial dynamic in our country. And while we talked about the teachings of Jesus and how the gospel of Jesus is ultimately the best solution to bring us together across racial lines and racial division, what I want to just briefly overview is what I see are two unhelpful solutions to issues of race in our country. And these are two sort of polar opposite proposed solutions and approaches, but I think that you'll recognize parts of them and see parts of them. And so I just want to help you identify them and show why maybe these may be limiting or unhelpful when compared to what we have in biblical wisdom in the gospel of Jesus. And so the first dynamic that I want to point out, or the first proposed solution to racial injustice and racial divide in our country, is what I'm going to call the ignore it and it will go away solution. Or we could call this the colorblind solution. This proposed solution says that racism and issues of race are way overblown in our country, and they are brought to the forefront and made primary far too often. Oftentimes people would say that racism hasn't really existed in America since the 60s during the civil rights movement and the Jim Crow era. It would say that many of the issues that we've had in our past as a nation are overemphasized, or they're so far in the past that they're not relevant to us today. And so while some people may be racist or have racist inclinations, as a country, it's not a major issue, and it's actually emphasized far too often. These people would often take instances of racism that we've seen on kind of the public sphere in our country. Think the recent deaths of Elijah McClain and Ahmaud Arbery and the killing of George Floyd and Dante Wright, and say these can actually be justified or they can be explained without bringing race into the conversation. Here's what I want to show you might be unhelpful or maybe problematic with the colorblind view. First is it ignores the role of history in shaping our present. We are all products of our historical background. And so we have to face the reality of our history as a nation. And for all the good that America has had in its past, it also has many sins. It is an undeniable historical fact that America was founded on the transatlantic slave trade. This involved kidnapping thousands and thousands of people from the continent of Africa, stuffing them into inhumane conditions on slave ships, and then bringing them over to the Western Hemisphere, to the North American continent, and holding them captive for free labor. Historians estimate that between the 15th and 19th century, more than 12 million people were forced from their homeland in Africa to the Western Hemisphere via that slave trade. After the Civil War, where emancipation and freedom was granted towards slaves, it didn't solve everything. We entered a period of history that we call Reconstruction, or many would call the Jim Crow era. This era came to be defined for African American and Black Americans by the lynching era. Lynching, which was a mob taking the life of a Black man, and sometimes a woman, oftentimes when they were completely innocent. They estimate that 5,000 African Americans were killed during this process. They were often beaten and tortured by mob violence and groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in 1866. And then the Jim Crow era was defined by the term separate but equal. This is oftentimes where Black Americans didn't have the same rights as white Americans in our country. They didn't have the right to vote. They were separated into other schools. They weren't allowed to use the same restaurants or bathrooms or transportation. They were excluded from living in various neighborhoods and denied opportunities such as loans and starting businesses that many majority culture people were free to have. The civil rights era in the 1960s fought against the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal mantra. And just to give you some context, my parents were born in 1957. And I still consider my parents pretty young, and yet they were alive during this era. And so this isn't our far nation's past. This is recent history. This is history that has bumped up against our current moment that still plays out in our public life today. The effects are still lingering for us. And so the result is, while many of us individuals may not be racist, may not be guilty of committing a racist act, the racist actions of individuals and entire corporate entities in our past, they have lingered into many parts of our society today. Secondly, a big problem with this proposed solution is that it underestimates the power of sin. It individualizes sin, as if sin can only be committed by a singular person. But what happens when you get groups of people under the power of sin, especially the power that works to divide us as a nation? The corrupt hearts of people who see one race as superior, can actually corrupt entire systems, can make its way into the basic building blocks of our society. Things like our justice system, our law enforcement, our education, our housing. This can create long-term distrust from one racial group to another that has been really on the receiving end of the injustice of those systems. And so that's the power of sin at work. We have a theological, biblical category to help us understand that our sins in the past as a nation have corrupted many systems that we still live under today. And so that is the colorblind solution and why I believe it's unhelpful. But kind of on the opposite end, a more recent proposed solution is what I'm going to call, and it's not a great name, but it's what I came up with, and it's the racism is everywhere solution. This primarily sees race at the focal point of every single discussion and issue in our country today. It would say that one's primary identity, how you define who you are and your relationship to the rest of the world, is primarily through your race. And sometimes we could add in maybe your gender and sexual orientation as well. And so this racism is everywhere solution would say that you must live in a constant state of awareness of how these dynamics operate in a person, and then you have to see everything through this lens. And you're either wrong or you're right, or we should listen to you or we shouldn't listen to you based on your race. And so if you are a person with more power, or sometimes we could say more privilege, so if you are white, you must quietly live in a constant state of apology, of guilt, and of awareness of your own racism, and then you must actively work to change it. Now, because our society has experienced the sin of racism, they would say, well, whether you know it or not, if you are white or if you are a person of privilege or power, you live in a constant state of racism, whether you intentionally do it or if just implicitly lives out through your life. And on the other hand, if you are a minority, you live in a constant state of oppression. You are a victim of racism, whether you've personally experienced it or not. And actually, if you try to argue this or offer a different perspective or offer another way of thinking about it, that actually only proves your racism, and defending it perpetuates the problem. That kind of encapsulates a lot of the racism is everywhere solution that we've seen gain more popularity recently. It's something you may have picked up on or seen bits and pieces of in our society. And here's where I think is kind of the main problem with this solution. The main problem is that we actually share a common humanity where we are made in God's image. And this is our primary identity, not our race, ethnicity, or nationality. Those things are important, but they come secondary to our primary identity, which is our humanity made in God's image. And so the way that race is popularly defined in our culture is one's skin color, one's facial features, and one's hair type. And those three features actually only make up 0.01% of our genetic makeup, which means that we as humans genetically share 99.99% of our humanity in common. And so it focuses overly on that 0.01% and actually works to divide us. In fact, by emphasizing what makes us different, by placing all the blame on people, on certain groups of people, in this case, people of privilege or white people, this actually ends up dividing us instead of pulling us together in true and honest friendship, which is the work of reconciliation that the gospel leads us into. And so, ironically, in trying to solve racism, it further keeps us apart, emphasizing our differences, and so that we're not actually able to come together, and thus creating more division, silencing, and hostility toward one another. By calling everyone a racist for anything they do, another effect of this is that it lessens the power of actual acts of racism that need to be dealt with in our society. It gives us less power in calling out real, important, significant acts of racism and racial injustice that we need to deal with as a society. In other words, it's wasted energy. It's energy that's wasted on dividing instead of building bridges and healing towards a better future. And then lastly, the racism is everywhere proposed solution often believes the worst intentions in people. It takes even innocent comments that have no superiority behind them and labels or aims or sees them from the perspective of racism. It asks people to conform to this view instead of building bridges through friendship, through welcoming and understanding, through acceptance and love, which is the way of Jesus. So at their core, whether we're talking about the colorblind solution or the racism is everywhere solution, while there may be some insight from both of these perspectives, I believe they end up both being ultimately unhelpful because at their core, they ignore God. They don't look to biblical wisdom. They don't have a consistent ethic based in the image of God, which is the ultimate foundation principle for a justice ethic for us as a people. And they're not rooted in the teachings of Jesus, what we talked about in our workshop, to love neighbor, to cross divides, and then ultimately to see the blood of Jesus as a reconciling power to remove hostility between people groups and to create one new humanity. And so I would just ask you to reflect a little bit on this. Have you been taught or have you seen either of these solutions, proposed solutions, play out in your community? And how are they different then? And how can the gospel of Jesus offer a better solution for us, one that brings us together instead of further divide us?